Hi students, in this video we're going to talk about characteristics of behavior for assessment. So as you're watching this video and taking your notes, I want you to be thinking about potential target behaviors for your own behavior modification project and paper, and think about what's going to be the best way to assess that behavior. So the first way to talk about behavioral assessment is with topography. Now this is looking at what specific movements are involved in making the particular behavior. So that might be a sequence of behaviors, correct form, and potentially picture prompts. Now oftentimes this is used in sports psychology or in coaches working with individuals to make sure that they're using the proper movements for a specific set of behaviors. Now this is important because if the incorrect behaviors are being used, an individual could become injured. So for example, here in this picture we have what are the behaviors that are improper for engaging in a squat behavior. And then these are the pictures that are associated with proper squat form. So in terms of measuring topography, somebody observing an individual or an individual trying to improve squat form might have the pictures and might be tracking whether or not the improper form was used or the proper form was used. In terms of self-care behavior, there might be steps involved in hand washing. So here are some sequences that an individual could follow, and this is a big one right now in terms of what step 1, wetting the hands, step 2, applying the soap, step 3, washing for at least 20 seconds, step 4, rinsing, step 5, drying the hands, and step 6, turning off the water with a paper towel. So working with a child or working with an individual with an intellectual disability, these steps might be out, and somebody observing might be tracking, is this individual making these specific sets of behaviors, this specific sequence, in the correct order. So that's topography. So another way to assess a behavior is by looking at how much the behavior occurs. And there's a distinction here between frequency, how many times a behavior occurs, and duration, which is how long the behavior occurs. So let's talk about both of these, and you could think about if one of these would be more appropriate for your own target behaviors. So with frequency, we're looking at rate. So how often a behavior occurs in a set time interval. Now this is often good for behaviors with clear beginnings and ends, and typically they're short duration. So maybe they occur often, but not at a super high rate during observation, because if they occur at a very high rate during the observation time frame, it might be difficult to track how many behaviors are occurring. So here I have an example that a student used in the past, and this particular student was interested in the behavioral excess of email checking as well as Facebook checking. And so this is something that the student believed was occurring at a high rate and was in excess and wanted to decrease it. So in terms of frequency rate, the student set up a chart that looked like this. Here was the specific behavior, email checking. Now again, it would be important to be thinking about how this was operationally defined. But what this person tracked, and they counted that it occurred 5 times within 60 minutes. And then put a note on the side, well, this person was expecting to hear about a class and so kept going back and checking the email. Now that might explain why this was happening at this particular rate. Now this person was also tracking, checking in with Facebook, and noted that this only happened once on the day that they observed. So the count was a 1, and they only did it 1 time within 60 minutes, but also put a note here saying, well, spent 30 minutes on the night before, engaged in FaceTime, so less likely today. So noting that maybe it was not happening at the typical amount because of what had happened the day before. So this is an example of how frequency or rate could be measured, just with a specific count. Now once the behavior is assessed like this for day 1, if this were a target behavior for your research project, you would want to be tracking it across more than 1 day. So this could be a tracking sheet, but then you might also want to be tracking it across time. And so here we have the number of sessions or the number of 60-minute sessions and the frequency of counting frequency of those specific behaviors during the 1-hour sessions. So you can see 5 times counted on the first day, and then it goes up to 6 times counted on the next day, and so forth and so on. So this is tracking across both Facebook checking and email checking across, it looks like, 10 different sessions. Another way to measure snacking is just to go ahead and make little check marks for each of the days and each of the number of instances. Now this is a good way to do it if it's something that can be tracked pretty easily, and you can track, you're graphing it while you are collecting the data right here. So this is an individual who was interested in snacking behavior, and again, it would be important to operationally define what is snacking behavior. But this person on day 1 marked off that snacking occurred 8 times, and then 8 times on day 2, and then down to 7 times, 5 times, 6 times, 6 times, and 5 times. Now in doing this though, we have tracking as well as graphing happening at the same time. Now, frequency was one way to measure amount. Duration is another way to measure amount. Now with duration, we're looking at total time spent engaging in a behavior in a time interval. So thinking back to that last example, it wouldn't be how many times somebody is engaged in snacking, but how much time is spent snacking. Now this is good for behavior that occurs less often but lasts for a time period. So amount of time spent exercising vigorously within a 2-hour time frame is an example that we're going to be looking at right here. And oftentimes it's reported as a percentage of the time. So how much time is spent within 2 hours engaged in vigorous exercise. So this is a tracking sheet that a student developed to assess this behavior. And you can see on day 1, they are, well, for each instance, each day that is observed, they have an onset, so when it started, as well as an offset. And they set it up such that it could be tracked more than one time across the 2-hour time frame. So for all of the days, 120 minutes is the time frame that it's going to be observed. And you can see on day 1 it didn't occur at all, so it was 0 duration. And then figuring out percentage, it was 0 as well too. On day 2, it looked like onset was at 7 and offset was at 7:15, so about 15 minutes out of 120 minutes, it's about 12.5%. And so you can see this is occurring across 14 days. We have onset and offset times. We have percentages, and then there's a column on the end for putting any kind of notes in there. And that's sometimes helpful so that you can see, well, wow, nothing was happening on day 3 and day 4. Well, that might be because these other things were going on. Exam, stressed out, not exercising, and that kind of helps to understand what was going on later. And then here we see that there was an injury, so that might have affected ability to engage in the behavior for the next day. So this is duration. It's not counting how much, but what percentage of time is spent engaged in the behavior. So we have these percentages, and then on the next sheet we have essentially the same data that appears in a graph so that we can see how the behavior is changed across time. So now we only have dots here, but this could also be done as a line graph to see how behavior changes across time. So in Moodle, I will post some more examples of some ways to track duration across time. This is a duration weekly data sheet, and this is used for tracking behavior of a child within class in terms of starting and ending and what percentage of time is spent on each of the days. And then this is another way to track duration, and it's just a schedule that goes from 7 in the morning till 9:30 at night, and it might be useful for tracking percentages of time spent engaging in a behavior. Now, another way to track behavior is to measure the intensity or magnitude of the behavior. Now, this could mean the amount of force, energy, or exertion that's required to produce the behavior. Now, we talked about this in an earlier set of videos, and this can be measured with a rating scale. So if an individual is working with perhaps a physical therapist or an occupational therapist and engaged in a type of behavior, it might be appropriate to ask the patient to rate pain on some kind of an intensity scale. So the intensity might be no pain at all, to moderate pain, to worst pain possible. And this might be something that the physical therapist or occupational therapist is working with the client across time to hopefully see decreases in the amount of pain associated with making certain behavioral responses. Another way to look at intensity or magnitude of behavior is to look at the weight used in a workout. And this is done in conjunction with reps or frequency. So if an individual is engaged in a behavior modification program to increase the intensity of workouts, they might be increasing how many times they engage in a specific set of responses, but they might also want to increase the weights. So here is an example. An individual is starting out with 35 pounds and then working up to 45 pounds with the barbell glute bridge. And then for a different set of behaviors, the one-arm dumbbell row, starting with 15 pounds, and then tracking 15 pounds across time and maybe increasing the number of reps. So the amount of weight would be the measure of intensity or magnitude of behavior. And then we could also track reps or frequency, which is a different measure that we just talked about. Another way to assess behavior is to use latency. Now with latency, we're looking at time, but we're looking at how much time from a stimulus event to the actual onset of behavior. So I'm going to give you a few examples here. So oftentimes this is used in a school setting to measure how long from when a teacher instructs a student to do something until the student actually starts work on the task. So here is an example here of a behavioral sheet to measure latency across time. So this is the behavioral definition. The student begins to read, write, or engage in the activity as instructed. And we're looking at the date. When is the instruction given? When does the actual child start the behavior, and how much time elapsed from when it was given to when it starts? So the idea here is to see if we can look at decreases in latency across time. Does it take less time from being prompted to actually starting the behavior? So here's some more examples of this. This is again a latency recording data sheet. So when is the cue, when is the behavior starting, and what is the elapsed time, kind of the latency. And here's a sheet that a student used in the past. They were tracking latency to start work on the computer. And what this student was noticing was that whenever he sat down to work on the computer, there was a lot of time spent scrolling through the news feed, going into social media, and so the student wanted to decrease that behavior. So the student was tracking what time did he sit down to start work on the computer for homework, and what time did he actually start the schoolwork. And at first it was about 45 minutes, but also again noticing feeling anxious, news feed about the pandemic was going on, and then also noting what's going on in terms of comments. So 45 minutes was the duration, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, 30 minutes, etc. So just to quickly clarify, some people have wondered how are latency and duration different? So latency is the time from the stimulus to the start of the behavior. So the teacher prompting, time for you to work on something, to the student actually working on it. Or it could be time to sit down at the computer to actually starting work on the computer. That's latency. So opening up the computer to start work. And duration is the behavior from the start to the stop. So this might be opening up the computer to closing the computer. So with latency, we're looking at How much time does it take to actually get started on a behavior? And duration is how much time is the person engaged in the behavior.